Thank you. I also join Saichiro Sensei in thanking Dean Wu Shinpo and his team, especially Professor Wei, in inviting me to be part of this panel today. I think to some extent I would also be agreeing with several things that Saichiro Sensei just said, but let me quickly start my time. I have a sense that the ideal way to look at China, India, and Japan is to see them as largest three economies in Asia, which will impact enormously, to some extent, determine the nature of economic and security architecture, the way it evolves in Asia and Asia Pacific. Apparently, debates on Asia's future seem to perhaps focus far too much on US-China and China-Japan relations. But if you notice that India's visibility over a period of time is growing, at least in Asia, then we will assume that perhaps India's relations with these other two major powers, Japan and China, would also be very, very crucial the way the scenarios evolve in Asia and Asia Pacific. To some extent, since debates focus on US-China, I would say China's growing closer relations over the last 15 years with the United States have partly brought Japan closer to India. But sometimes assumption also is that perhaps that is what is pushing Chinese afar from India. We can debate on whether we agree with that kind of assumption or not. We also understand China's continuing rise further. And also for about last 2 years, several irritations in China-India relations could perhaps also be seen as a factor binding India and Japan, bringing them over a period of time closer. But is there a confrontation? I see no confrontation. I think all three powers fundamentally are pursuing hedging strategies, which continue not just to allow, but allow them to thrive their socio-economic linkages that continue to be also an important force in how relations are organized amongst these three states. So after decades of disengagement during Cold War period, it seems that India-Japan, both security, nuclear and economic relations are now growing. Nevertheless, we have to remember that Japanese sensitivities against nuclear weapons and of course India's obsession with non-alignment continuously decelerates that momentum of India-Japan relations becoming very closer. At the same time, Japanese decline, both demographic and economic, is also making Japanese perhaps see India as a potential partner, as a counterweight to China. So there are both pluses and minuses, things that accelerate the momentum and things that decelerate the momentum over a period of time. But if they want to come closer, what are the resources these three states put in the hands of their national regimes to determine the foreign policies and move the foreign policies forward? Most important is demographics. Median age tells us what kind of societies these three are. You can see Japanese median age is 46 plus, and of course by comparison Indian
how old?
Sorry?
Definition of the median age.
Median age is when you divide population in half and half. 50 and see what is the age at the middle. And that's the way to look at the overall population, and aging societies do make a difference compared to extremely young societies. At least there is an enthusiasm. I'm looking at their GDP in PPP terms, so that makes it $20+ trillion for China and about $5 trillion for Japan and $8+ trillion for India. And growth rates also are interesting. You can see Japan's growth rates are about 1.2 compared to China and India growth rates being 6 or 7 depending on how you calculate these things. Defense expenditures, according to CIPRI, I had to take a common denominator, so I used one institution, is $200+ billion for China. And you can see the impact in terms of modernization, aircraft carriers, etc., etc. India is also touching about $56 billion, and Japan now is the third in Asian case. It's $46 billion of defense expenditure. Japan is currently the oldest society. If you allow me to really use a harsh term, the sale of adult diapers today in Japan is more than child diapers. That tells us a nature of population in that sense. 63 or plus are about 28%, almost 30% of their 127 million people compared to India and China being 1 billion plus populations. So this population is supposed to shrink further in foreseeable future. So it's a social psychological shrink that we notice happening in the population. China's population also, interestingly, at this stage, working population is majority, but it's also rapidly beginning to age. So it's moving in same direction where Japan has accepted that it will have much larger population to deal with rather than productive population. India's youth bulge is an important story these days. Only 6% people beyond 63 years of age, but that has something to do with longevity as well. And therefore, there are several footnotes one can put, but I'm giving a broad bird's view of how these societies are evolving. When societies are active and thriving, they put money in the hand of state. How they do that? By household savings. Japan, for example, in about 1955 had 12% of savings. It went up in 1975, the growth rate, the GEES model, 23%. Now imagine it has come down to about 5%, because enormous health expenditure on old age is what is causing less of savings. China's savings were of course negligible until late 1970s. They grew to 12% in 1980s. And imagine they are today about 40%, which is enormous. So when you look at Chinese debt, you look at offset that savings at home can produce over a period of time. India also had about less than 10% savings for a long period of time. They have risen about 25%. But there are undeclared savings in our societies, and India is notorious for undeclared savings in terms of money which is not accounted and declared, and gold and other stuff that is enormous in case of India. So what is happening to these societies in terms of relating to each other over a period of time? I'm looking at India, China. Let me first talk of irritants. If you're touching the pulse, the first thing that comes to the mind is a little bit of temperament, which is showing that there is an irritation. And particularly, India had received a waiver from Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2008, and China was on board in giving of that waiver. But now, of course, there are issues on the table we want to discuss more. This is a continuing irritant between China-India relations for about 2 years. India also wants to put name of Azhar Masood, for example, on United Nations sanctions list. Again, Chinese wish to discuss that a little more. We understand their relations with Pakistan are crucial here, but this is an irritant again. And of course, continuing and growing enormous trade deficit is contributing to what Saichiro Sensei said, trust deficit. And now we have parallel OBORs. I will tell you what are those parallel OBORs running both by Chinese and Indians. Historical difficulties also continue. Even if we have learned how to deal with them, we don't really get very upset with those issues. Our boundary issues, China-Pakistan relations, and now particularly China-Pakistan economic corridor issue, for Chinese issue of Tibetans in India. These are continuing issues. We have over a period of time learned how to deal with it, but they are still there. In terms of future, mention was also made of UN Security Council reforms. One can say Chinese position on India's case has evolved over a period of years, but it's really very slow evolution. And therefore, increasingly, it seems that we are also getting into enormous energy and other resource-related competition. And of course, both a necessity-driven foreign policy, but more so ambition-driven foreign policies are also creating a certain amount of irritant. The good part, and I'm ending with the good part, is that there are some fundamental drifts happening in China-India relations. One, relations are moving clearly from bilateral to multilateral. And when we sit in multilateral forums, we find far more things that we think similar and we find each other at home with. And therefore, there is a certain positive energy generated in those multilateral forums, which are overall giving a good spin-off effect to bilateral relations. Second, which I personally feel very convinced about, is relations are shifting from state to society. So increasingly, intersocietal relationships, which were also mentioned in the morning by the former president of Turkey and of course by the economic Nobel laureate, societies are getting increasingly integrated, and I think increasingly foreign policies of the state will be influenced by societies. The hope lies for me there. Let me very quickly look at India-Japan bilateral relations. What is the pulse that if we are feeling there? Of course, we had cordial but very minimal relations in Cold War years. And 1998, when India tested nuclear weapons, was seen as the lowest point in the relationship because Japanese were really upset and were one of the last country to really accept India's new status and begin to cooperate and work with us in nuclear commerce. Beginning of the change happens in year 2000 when Prime Minister Mori visits here and India and Japan establish a global partnership for 21st century. trade and investments begin to grow. India becomes gradually the largest recipient of Japanese ODA. Earlier it was China. So here it seems that this momentum was clearly accelerated, influenced by India's overall improving relations with the United States and India's security dialogues with various major powers after 1998 nuclear tests of India, and Japan was one of those countries we were engaging at that time. Thank you. Japan supported India in East Asia Summit and of course also supports us in the Suppliers Group membership, which is in contrast to the Chinese. Japan also has regularly naval joint exercises with us, and of course last week only in Ahmedabad we had a Africa Development Fund meeting where about 81 countries representatives were sitting, and India and Japan have launched what they call Freedom Corridor compared to economic corridors connecting the littorals of Asia and Africa. Likewise, you have now increasingly hyperactive policy of foreign Prime Minister Modi, which is also seeing engagement with Japan. Now, of course, we are hearing the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor of United States and, of course, the new Silk Road, new two initiatives of United States where India is put clearly at the center. So there are parallel corridors running, you can see, which is not the best thing to do. India-Japan trilateral relations, if you want to see, and that's my last slide now. I still assume that the destiny of Asia will be clearly shaped, not so much by external interventions increasingly as we shift from bilateral to multilateral, from state to societies, relating to each other, influencing foreign policy. These three states will really be integral to how Asia is evolving in coming years, both in terms of security and economic relationships. All three of them in the meantime, in the short term period, it looks like continue to perhaps privilege their bilateral relations with the United States much more than their bilateral relationships between the three of them, which is the current state of affairs, but it would potentially change, I suppose. It also is based on the historic positive relationships. All three had shared national liberation movement connections in early 20th century. Some of that becomes important when you want to look at intersocietal relationships. And again, in 21st century, as I said, we are shifting to intersocietal relationships. Those memories become very, very important in that sense. Also, culture becomes important if you shift from state to society. Buddhism is the most enduring link between these all three societies of Asia, which are, I think, going to be really important in terms of importance of the role that they will play. India and China both are major recipients of Japanese ODA. But of course, as I said, there are limitations in the meantime in short term. China's unprecedented rise is raising debates all over as to how to balance it, restrain it, contain it. Depends on the word you want to use it. But sentiment of somehow addressing that unprecedented rise of China is very shared and common across Asia, also shared by Japan and India. And therefore, it seems that India is seen as potentially counterweight. But I believe India is at best willing to contribute in soft balancing and hedging and not in hard balancing. I can explain that if there are questions on that subject later. So what is the reality today? It seems that China has launched a very, very ambitious OBOR. India was absent in that meeting. Of course, soon after that, we see that a week later, India and Japan are launching a freedom corridor linking littoral of Asia and Africa in Ahmedabad in the African Development Bank meeting. This week, of course, United States is reviving what Hillary Clinton used to call the new Silk Route and the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor. They are again locating India at the center of it. It looks like somewhere the parallel practice of OBORs from two directions, which is not the best thing to happen. I think the best was an example of regional economic partnership where China, Japan, India, all three were sitting together. But it seems there is a little of an irritation again even there, which is appearing now. So I assume certain rattling will continue over a period of time, but we will stabilize because we are shifting, as I said, fundamentally from state to societies. And societies will link with each other much better. I close here and say thanks. And that's my mail. If you're angry with me, send me an angry mail later.